Okay, so this is podcast number 2, and this is our early morning walk. So our voices are a little raspy and we're a little out of breath. It's because it's both early and we're still out of shape.
And we haven't gotten coffee yet.
Right.
So we're off to a coffee shop.
Admittedly, I did have a little bit of coffee, so I might have
Cheated on me.
a little pep in my step. If you're around LA and you see two people wired together talking,
That's us.
one's a little taller than the other, chances are it's us.
Okay. So,
The topic du jour.
what is the topic du jour?
We're kind of zooming out because whenever we discuss any of these topics that we're talking about, whether it's public policy or Second Amendment or anything, we're really invoking the laws of this nation, and that's founded, of course, in the Constitution. So let's pull back. Let's look at not just the Constitution, but the reasons why and how these laws were put into place in the first place, because that really is the architecture from which all these other conversations, forget about morality, forget about people's feelings. There are laws in this country. There's a design of this legal system in this country on all levels.
But you're talking, to summarize it, you're talking context and intent of laws and legal structures.
Right.
Right.
And that's completely independent of, well, I feel it should be this way, or wouldn't it be great if it was we all sang
Kumbaya.
Kumbaya.
Right. So, and I think this is, from my perspective, particularly important because what is going on in the United States or America is constantly compared to being more successful or less successful to other cultures and countries like Europe or South America or whatnot. And their culture and their legal systems and their intent and structure are very, very different. Sometimes in explicit ways and sometimes in subtle ways. So, you have to think about, well, why is the UK more successful at X? Well, they have 800 years of doing Y, and their laws and legal systems and culture are set up to do that, where we're not. So, all countries are not created equal. All countries have different legal systems and cultures and moral outlooks, and that gets expressed both in law and in culture and in education, et cetera. And I think we should take a big step back and look at the foundation of the country and sort of what the intent was, what the founders were trying to do with the legal system, how it's played out, where there have been inflection points in our understanding or interpretation of it, et cetera.
They do call it the Great American Experiment.
Right.
Because we have broken new ground. No country's ever had the liberties and rights granted to the people.
Well, stop right there. Liberties and rights are not granted. That's the first. That is.
You got me again. You got me again. We had this conversation last week.
Right. That's the first, fundamental misunderstanding, right? In many other countries, they say, these are the following rights that are granted to you by the government and that you can exercise within our society. And the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Anti-Federalist and Federalist Papers, which are writings about these documents, clearly say that these are divine and God-given rights, and that the Constitution exists not to grant rights, but to limit the power of the federal government around those rights which you have natively and inalienably. Inalienable in their context means unable to divide or give away or sublimate. Right? You have an inalienable right to free speech. You have an inalienable right to defend yourself. You have an inalienable right to associate with who you want to associate with. These are rights that God gave you, or as they would say, the divine providence or nature.
So it's almost as if we don't need, as citizens, we don't need to read the Constitution. The lawmakers need to read the Constitution.
Correct. The lawmakers are the limitations on government, not on people. It doesn't say...
Sort of the audience for the Constitution, essentially.
Well, it's not 100% true. We are the audience of the Constitution insofar as we participate in government life, and insofar at the time people needed to vote on and approve the Constitution. The Constitution is a compact. It's a contract between the states. Right? So let's take a big step back and let's just sort of talk about revolutionary history, because there's a very long arc and it doesn't just include the United States. So the sort of age of revolution can roughly be sketched out to 1650 to 1850, 200 years. And there were a number of revolutions that occurred. The ones that sort of most prominent and most applicable in my mind to the United States are the Cromwellian or Glorious Revolution in England in the mid 1600s, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution. And they're all related. So the fundamental governing force from, say, roughly the Middle Ages, 600 until 1800, was one of monarchy, one where there was a king and vassals and princes and dukes and chevaliers and knights, and there was a military order that was hereditary and inheritable. The rulers of the kingdom were, quote unquote, ordained by God through the church, and they set the tone and culture of and the laws of the country, and it was up to them to rule people as sort of benevolent dictators. And the fundamental idea was the church ordained a king. The king had a duty to the people to protect them. The people had a duty to work for the king and supply him with his wants and needs, and he was stronger and more capable militarily. And if you were born into aristocracy, then you had power and privilege. And if you were not born into aristocracy, you had a responsibility. This is a horrible way to live if you're in one side of the equation versus the other. And, as people complain about, income inequality and power inequality, we've got nothing on medieval England or medieval France or medieval Germany. I mean, it's just a completely different world, right? But slowly, from the time of the Magna Carta in the 1100s, that structure was attacked as inequitable. So at first the nobility said, hey, why don't we get a say in how we rule at all? Why are we at the whim of the king? And they rebelled, and they forced the king to sign something called the Magna Carta, and it started to grant these initial rights, like trial by your peers. And in their mind, your peers meant other nobility. So the king couldn't judge noble people at a whim. There had to be a trial, and there had to be other nobles. And slowly, the power between the king and those that he ruled started to get chipped away over the arc of 800 years. It took forever. And it ended in Cromwell's Glorious Revolution, where Parliament took power from the king and actually beheaded him. And unfortunately then, sort of reduced themselves to minor squabbles about how much money they could make and keep and exploit. And Cromwell threw a fit and got rid of Parliament and ruled as the protector of the realm for 5 years as sort of a pseudo king. And then the British invited another king in. But those are slow chipping away, and Parliament never lost all of its power in England after that. It still kept some privileges, and more happened. And this comes in the shadow of slowly fundamental changes in technology that empowered individuals to assert themselves in ways that they weren't unable to. So the gun, for example, was a radically different societal changing instrument, because no longer did you have to, from early age, train to be a horse-mounted warrior in armor and have, no other schooling, and to be able to be successful on the battlefield. Right now, you take some putz of a peasant, train him for 3 weeks how to shoot, right? And the charging knight could, charge down the hill and bang, and he's dead. And that's a radically different, way of expressing a society when military power is now distributed. And the Swiss proved it in battles against the Holy Roman Empire and were able to carve out their own little entities. And they created one of the first federations where there were small cantons that glommed together in a governmental agent called, they called it the Helvetic Republic. But, these things slowly gestated in Europe. And England didn't pay attention to what was going on in America, right? They threw colonists over there, and the colonies ruled themselves in general on their own for a couple hundred years. I mean, the British would send ships over and extract money and whatnot, but you had this very, very, very malformed colonial relationship where you had private companies that had colonies that were chartered by the king. The king sort of said, I give you the right to go there and I will tax you. You had crown colonies where the king and the monarchy actually owned and ran the colonies. But almost all of the colonies by the mid 1750s had some form of executive branch and governor and some sort of legislative branch in a house of Burgess with an upper chamber and a lower chamber. And this very much modeled the British experience of a king and a House of Commons and a House of Lords. So the House of Commons, you didn't have to be a lord to be a member of. In the House of Lords, you had to be a lord to be a member of. So this is how monarchy and aristocracy kept some level of privileges and power throughout the time. And it's sort of into that, cauldron of intellectual and economic turmoil that you have the American Revolution, right? So you have 13 independent and separate colonies that have their own legal and their own administrative systems with almost no overlap, that were all treated the same by the British, but they were separate. And this is why in the First Continental Congress, the representatives from the Carolinas were like, hey, I know you Bostonians and you people from Massachusetts, you're having problems with the king, but we're not. Why? We don't need to step up and join your fight. This is your issue, not our issue. And the first big sort of intellectual argument that Adams and Franklin and the Northerners had with the Southerners was that, no, we are all American colonies. We may be separate, but we will all be put under the same thumb of the British. And they were, right? They all had the same taxation issues, and they all had the same blockade issues. But it took in the summer of 1776, it took months and months and months of argument and going back to the houses of representation in the states to get to the first big inflection point, which is the Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. That was the first radically different document, right? Prior to that, from the early 1770s until 1776, while the British were passing what the Americans called the Intolerable Acts, they weren't sure as a group if they were going to be fighting for independence. They were fighting for representation. They felt they were British. They felt that they deserved representation in the House of Commons, that they deserved to vote on and participate in the governing of their own lives, just as people in England are able to. So in their view, why is somebody from Boston, England, and there is a town called Boston, England, why are they able to vote on their taxation and somebody from Boston, Massachusetts couldn't? Right? Because we're a colony? So what? We're British.
This is all financial, though.
It's more than financial, right? I mean, it's
not like they can vote by proxy by Zoom. There's still the logistics of dealing with the information
Well,
and all that stuff. I mean, things move at a snail's pace as it is. They're crossing an ocean.
But things moved at a snail's pace anyway. I mean, they had very, very different lives. So you elected some guy from Boston and you gave him some orders and you sent him off to England for a 3-year, House of Commons stint or whatever. And then when you heard something big, you wrote a letter and you sent it over there. Things just moved slower in general. So who cares?
So what kinds of things were they? I'm just curious, like, what kinds of things were they deciding on? What were these? What was the representation they were seeking?
Well,
in the area of.
Well, let's invert it. What were the intolerable acts that caused them to say this doesn't work, right? So they, it started about money, absolutely, right? The American theater of battle in the 7 Years' War in the French and Indian, what we call the French and Indian War, which is actually the 7 Years' War, which was a global struggle between the British Empire and the French Empire.
Mm-hmm.
The British felt that they paid a lot of money and spent a lot of time and energy and treasure in defending the American colonists, and therefore the American colonists needed to pay up. And the American colonists were like, we're pretty happy with taxation the way it is. I mean, like, we're not really down with this new stuff. And so the British just start ratcheting up the pressure, and they started taxing things like, they started with like playing cards and postage stamps. And, do you want to get a deed on your house? That's an extra 10 shilling because you're American,
mm-hmm.
right? So it's just the basic functions of everyday life started to become invaded by these oppressive taxes that you had no say in. And then it became, you can only trade with British ships that go to London, and you have no freedom. And, most Americans moved originally for freedom or economic opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And the British were like, yeah, thanks, pay up now. And, at first the Americans, colonists were like, sure, we'll pay up, but we got to vote on it. Let us participate.
Mm-hmm.
And King George went, yeah, no. Parliament went, yeah, no. Now, as an aside, King George was going insane at this time. A known insanity. It was a weird time in British government, but still Parliament did not say, you're right. Let's establish Boston and Philadelphia and New York and places in South Carolina as, representative cities that people can vote and they can send a representative. And, in my mind, it's silly. Give the Americans 5 votes in Parliament. It's not going to sway the difference, but they won't have the argument about revolution anymore. Right? So in this cauldron of pay up and the Americans going, hey, we want representation. Why are you censoring what we can say? Why are you putting troops into our houses and making us bear the cost of them? Why are you not letting us trade freely and giving monopoly to your favored companies? Why are you interdicting our freedoms when we have no representation? And the British were like, because the king is the king and you bow to the king and the king is the king.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you have this struggle between free people and subjects, citizens and subjects. And, the first shots of the American Revolution occurred on the Boston, in Boston, right? The shot, when they were protested. Now, interestingly, John Adams defended the British soldiers. He said they actually did nothing wrong. They were accosted by a mob and threatened and, thrown and frozen oyster shells were thrown at them. And, people were screaming fire, fire from behind them. And one of the guys shot and he got them off. He proved that they did not instigate the violence, but yet that's sort of the first deaths and the hallmark of it. But the first battle of the American Revolution actually happened around a very prominent, issue today: gun control. The first battle was in the wake of these mob riots in Boston. The British General Gage felt very uncomfortable with the populace around him in the countryside, in the towns just outside of Boston, having arms. He was not comfortable with the colonists having access to gunpowder and muskets and cannon. So he said, I'm going to go take your guns so I feel safe. Right? And this is not the historical comparison is if somebody in, say, Portland said, I'm not comfortable with these Antifa riots and, that them trying to burn down the courthouses and them trying to, mob people and there's gun murders are up. I'm going to take everybody's gun in Portland and the surrounding area. It's a very similar idea. And famously, a number of people inside of Boston had spies and they learned about what the British were doing and they had to know which road they were going down. And this is, Paul Revere's very famous, one lantern if by land and two if by sea, right? One if they're going to go through the bay and disembark and then march, or if they're going to come out the neck of Boston. And the first real battle, was Lexington and Concord, where the British came to take Americans' guns away. And the Americans went, no. That's a hard no. And, I've stood at the North Bridge in Concord, where the British stood against American farmers, basically. Citizen farmers were standing on a hill, a couple hundred of them. And the British Army was standing at a bridge going, whatever, you're going to stay there. We're going to sack your town and we'll get out of here. And the Americans went, no. And they charged the hill and took the bridge and started rolling the British all the way back to Boston over the entire day. And thousands of American citizens showed up and said, we are not willing to have the government come and take our guns. This is going back to our original thing. We have a fundamental right to self-defense. You're not going to impinge on that right. No.
Was that original complaint because they wanted to be able to defend themselves against the British specifically? Or is it just they lived in a rough neighborhood and they wanted the right to defend themselves personally?
There are state charters from the 1600s that say that the right to self-defense and the right to arms is a fundamental right. Because when you leave Boston and go 300 miles west of Boston and you're in the middle of what is now Massachusetts, at the time it was Indian country, and at the time it was wild country with all sorts of animals, and you were hacking a farm out of the woodlands, and you were doing incredibly hard work, and there was no army, there was no police, there was nothing. It's not that there was a tough neighborhood, there was no neighborhood. You were it.
No 911 to call.
No 911, right? At best, you rang a bell or you sent your kid to run over to the next farm 2 miles away and somebody else showed up, right? They had a very different outlook. They had an outlook that they took care of themselves because they were in the middle of nowhere. And damn you if you're going to take my ability to defend myself.
Well, at this point, people who are against
at this point back then, or at this point?
No, at this point right now in our conversation, people who are anti-gun, let's call them, would say, well, this just props up my point. It was a different time and place, different circumstances.
Sure.
And of course, I can understand that back then you would want it, but now we're in a different situation, civilized society, 911, all that stuff.
Which is all well and good, but there's a mechanism in the Constitution itself that says if you want to change any element of the Constitution, here's how you do it.
Yeah.
Right? If you want to get rid of the Second Amendment, call a convention of the states or have 2/3 of Congress pass a resolution to be approved by the states. There are multiple mechanisms to get rid of the Second Amendment, right? No problem. But the Second Amendment does not say, I'm granting you the right to a gun. The Second Amendment says, you have a right to a gun, and the government shall not impinge on that right. So you can rewrite the Second Amendment and say, you have the right to some guns, or you have a right to a gun, but the government can impinge on that right to this degree. And there's a mechanism to do that. Right? We've used that mechanism, since the Constitution passed, 16, 15, 16, 17 times. Sure, go do it. But the point is you can't. Right? And that's one of the fundamental conflicts that we're trying to deal with, which is there was a clear intent and a clear purpose and a clear context to all of the amendments, and there's a mechanism to change them. Just follow the rules. Don't make them up. Don't try to implement things that go against the implied process. It's sort of like saying, these are the rules of chess, but I want to move my knight to that corner, so I'm just going to do it. Them's not the rules. Right? And those aren't the rules that the state signed up with. So, but going back, we have this unbelievable revolution against the British. How we won, nobody really understands, although, we can understand it because the British didn't put enough resources into the fight. And we form a government in 1792, under something called the Articles of Confederation. So the first American government was the Articles of Confederation, which was a very, very loose sort of like, hey, if one state needs help, it can ask another state for help, right? There was very little federal power, and it didn't work. It just didn't work, right?
Why not?
Because states started competing with each other. States started conflicting with each other. Taxation was a real problem. There was never enough money for do stuff. When one state asked for help, the other state went like, well, think about it. It wasn't enough of a tight enough compact to make this work, right? And then we had what I would call the Second American Revolution. And the Second American Revolution was the Second Continental Congress, where we created the Constitution. When the Second Continental Congress was created, they thought they were going in to make adjustments to the Articles of Confederation. And they realized very early on, like, that this thing's so badly formed, we gotta start over.
Mm-hmm.
And they closed the windows and they closed the doors and they said, we need to have an honest, open conversation without people looking in, and let's talk about this. So they wrote a document. And they said, here are the powers that the states are going to be willing to give up and give to the federal government, and here are the limitations of the powers of the federal government. But two key issues. One, the states were still considered sovereign. They were considered the fundamental power. States can do things that the federal government cannot, not the other way around at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is that under the 9th and 10th Amendments, the Constitution is clearly instructed that only those things that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution are granted to the federal government. Otherwise, the power and the rights relied to the states and the people. Right? The Constitution is a limiting document, not an expansive document.
Funny, because I kind of took it for granted in school learning this, but it means much more to me as an adult in this era that, it invokes God. It invokes natural rights.
Yes.
It invokes the abilities and rights that we all have as free human beings.
Correct.
It doesn't start from the perspective of your subjects and here's what you can do, here's what you can't do.
Correct.
I think a lot of people either don't consider that, don't understand its implications, or maybe just naturally disagree with it or remember it completely differently. But that's the table on which this whole thing is set. Yeah.
Exactly.
If you don't get that, then naturally it's like you're not going to get anything else in this entire conversation, or any conversation about the Constitution or about laws and government.
Right. That's exactly right. So, it has these very, very, very weird affects into today's society. For example, what is the fundamental nature that justifies federal power in, across certain items? Here's a good example. Where does the federal government get off saying that, carjacking is a federal crime? Right? It doesn't cross state borders. There are state crimes for, carjacking. There are federal crimes for carjacking. Why should there are these multiple layers of laws? Because almost all federal power outside of, say, military and immigration and some taxation derives from the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. The Commerce Clause says that the federal government shall have power to sort of pass laws around the commerce between the states and between states and other nations, and between states and the Indian nations, right? So at the time, they didn't want North Carolina having a different set of rules to trade with South Carolina and Pennsylvania, right? They didn't want this patchwork of trade laws and immigration laws, etc. So they said, look, if you've got some wood that you're selling to make furniture, and you harvest it in South Carolina and you ship it to North Carolina can't say, well, that wood has a 1 penny per 1,000 foot board feet tax, but if the same wood is coming from Pennsylvania, it's 3 pennies, right? Because the states all said, we want to be treated equally among ourselves, so we have to give up a little bit of this power to the federal government to make sure that we get treated the same, right? But what does that have to do with, say, carjacking or horse thievery, right? How does the federal, because the federal government made the argument and the courts agreed, carjacking can affect how people perceive the city in which the carjacking occurs, which means that people may not visit from out of state for tourism, and therefore carjacking affects interstate commerce.
Once you open up that door, you have a lot of things you can say about various cities.
Correct. And much of this was justified in a court case called Wicker v. Filburn, I believe, where during the Depression, the federal government said, you have to charge this amount for your hay and wheat and feed. And this guy said, okay, great. I grow my own wheat and I feed it to my cows. I don't need to charge anybody anything or pay any taxes on it. And the federal government said, the fact that you're not putting this onto the market affects the interstate market, so we control it.
Wow.
Right.
That sounds like an overreach.
Well, since the mid-30s, it's been the basis of the federal government saying anything you do can affect commerce, therefore we can regulate anything you do.
Was this for him to consume himself or for him to sell?
For him to consume and his animals to consume. It never left his farm.
Pretty severe.
Right.
I mean,
that's like saying you not buying insurance affects the insurance industry, so we have the right to tell you to buy insurance. This doesn't it? A la Obamacare, which was then justified under different reasons, because it's not that we made you buy insurance, it's that we just taxed you when you didn't do something.
I was thinking if you brew your own beer, you don't go out to bars or buy Michelob in the supermarket, you consume it yourself.
Which is, again, why the federal government has said until Carter's time that nobody can brew beer. And
Seriously?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And Carter said, well, people can brew, X gallons for personal consumption. And then, boom, a microbrewery industry just exploded.
Mm-hmm.
Much like the federal government saying marijuana is illegal, and now the states are saying, well, not so much. And, there's always this tension. But much of the federal government's power is derived from the fact that behavior impacts commerce between the states. So go, right? They can regulate guns because the materials ship between states in order to make the gun, right? All sorts of power. It's the anchor of that power. But I don't believe that's what it was intended for. That's been a stretch under federal power overreach. But if you read the Constitution and you read it with the right eye, you read it with the eye, as you said, we're citizens. We have freedoms. The Constitution is a document that says the government can do these things and these things only, and it can't do these things and it can't do anything else.
In other words, so if it's not in the Constitution, it's assumed to be legal and proper.
Not quite. If it's not in the Constitution, the power to regulate it devolves to the states.
Okay.
Or the people, right? Which is why you can have different drinking ages in the past between states. You can have different speed limits. Here's one, you have different self-defense laws, right? Why does one state have stand your ground and another state have duty to retreat? Because the states have the sovereign power over their citizens, not the federal government. And the states can dictate behaviors in a way that the federal government can't. The federal government has to do it under an explicit power.
Mm-hmm.
which in many cases they don't have. All right. So here's a great example. The federal government has the power of taxation, but they had to pass an amendment to grant them the power to tax income. Think about that for a second.
So the taxation before was only on goods? Like
was on
sell goods? Or
on goods and services and tariffs and all,
basically sales tax.
well, sales tax, shipment taxes, use taxes, land taxes,
But not income.
but not income. We needed the 16th or 17th Amendment to get income tax. Until then, nobody did income tax at the federal level. It wasn't legal, right? Which is why, in my view, you should interpret the Constitution as narrowly as possible. It was intended to be as narrow as possible.
Yeah, you hear that phrase a lot when they're discussing laws with, in one of the circuits or
Right.
Supreme Court, how, narrow or broad the interpretation can be. And I've always kind of wondered, you can kind of play favorites if you're for or against something.
Sure.
Broaden it out or...
Right. And this is where you get, the two fundamental judicial philosophies of today are sort of strict construction, original intent, or living document. One side, mainly the conservative side, says, look, when somebody passes a law, we should understand what they meant by the law and try to adhere to what they meant by the law as much as possible, because we have mechanisms to both change the law and to change the Constitution. When they said, for example, a person should be secure in their home and their papers, does that literally mean only things that are written down on paper? Or does that mean that in your communication, in whatever form that takes, right? How do we deal with that?
Interesting. I can see... it's funny, in one circumstance I can see narrow, in another circumstance I can see broad.
Right.
It's interesting. That's a fascinating juxtaposition.
So when they wrote the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, did they mean only the arms that were available at the time? Or did they mean arms that are available at any time?
Mm-hmm.
Right? They could have said, right, the right to keep musket and black powder cannon and, the list of these weapons shall not be infringed. But that's not what they said.
Right.
They said arms.
And they weren't stupid, short-sighted
They're
people.
not stupid, short-sighted people, right? So as you approach modern-day problems and as you approach modern-day laws, you have to think about what's your interpretation methodology, what's your understanding of the formation documents, what's your and on one hand, you have sort of the Constitution and the federal government rules everything, and the states are subsidiary. And on the other hand, you have, no. The states are primary, and they gave up a limited set of power to form the federal government, and the federal government should be restricted to only that power which is explicitly granted to them and none other, right? And these are very different outlooks.
What are the names of the different groups that subscribe to the two different philosophies?
Oh, well, in today's parlance?
Yeah.
In general, what we would call a progressive or a liberal or the Democratic Party, in general, ascribes to that the federal government has ultimate power and that the states are subsidiary. And conservative, libertarian Republicans tend to believe that the federal government should be limited in power and the states are states' rights. However, that's not so 100% clear. For example, if you ask a California Democrat whether or not the state should be subsidiary to the federal government when it comes to marijuana and immigration, they would say, we're not helping the federal government go pound sand, we're going to release illegal immigrants into the country, into the state, even if the federal government asks for it, even we're just not going to help them. Sanctuary states, sanctuary cities because of states' rights, right? But there's very, very, very little difference in my view, from a intellectual process for the same right that's being asserted by, say, Texas or Montana that says, well, we're not going to help the ATF hunt down ghost guns and gun owners because the right to bear arms is a Second Amendment fundamentally protected right. Nor is it different right? Like then some of the arguments that slaveholding states said, where slavery was legal, and why should the federal government be able to come in and tell us to not have slaves? Now, I'm not saying slavery is a good thing. Slavery is a horrible, 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 evil thing. Let's get beyond that. But the argument is a similar states' rights argument, right?
It has to be consistency, essentially.
Right.
And acknowledgement of hypocrisy.
And the Northern Republicans proposed an amendment to the Southern states saying, we will amend the Constitution and say that we will never get rid of slavery in current slaveholding states. We just don't want it to expand anymore. And the slaveholding states said, no, we reject that. And the slaveholding states went a step beyond, not only by fighting the Republican Party, but by taking federal property when they seceded from the Union, right? So there's a difference between saying, I'm not going to help you, and I'm no longer a party of the federal government. Those are two different statements. Slavery was a huge part of the Civil War, but there's another part that isn't really talked about, which is that the federal government was putting tariffs and trade restrictions and benefits to the northern states and trade restrictions to the southern states in very subtle ways, and the South was not having any of it. And the concern that the southern states had is if you added California and New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado and Utah and all of these new western states as non-slave only states, you would go from a 50-50-ish in the Senate to a 60-40, 70-30-ish, and they would lose their political power, and eventually they would be overrun. And that the combination of wanting to maintain slavery, wanting to assert their states' rights, and wanting to be treated economically the same led them to conclude that the North, as much as they would say they would be compromising, would eventually not be. Now, they may be right, they may be wrong, it doesn't matter. But they said that they no longer wanted to participate in a union of states into a federal government in which they felt that they were not being fairly treated. Now, that does not justify what they did. It does not justify slavery. Slavery was a huge part of it, but it's wrapped in a bigger picture than just it's all about slavery. There's other aspects that slavery touched upon, and without slavery, we wouldn't have had the Civil War for sure. But it's not just slavery, right? What happens if, here's a great example. What happens if Texas tells the federal government that, no, we're not going to take away people's guns? Let's say the federal government just says, we're taking away people's guns, and Texas says, no, we're not going to. And the federal government, invades, and Texas fights back. And we have a civil war over that issue. Is it about guns, or is it about the rights of Texas and Texans to, right? It's a little more nuanced.
Yeah.
I'm sure some people are going to misinterpret what I say or what we say here and, say we love slavery, but
no,
it's completely not true.
We do not love slavery.
We do not. So there's sort of two subjects that I want to explore and end on. One is the French Revolution and how it differs fundamentally from the American Revolution. And the other is sort of the intent and the formation of the current federal government under the Constitution and how it compares and contrasts to our European cousins. So the French Revolution was actually a result of the American Revolution. So what happened? The French, they hate the British, hate them with the passion of a thousand burning suns. And largely Benjamin Franklin, and to some extent Adams may have helped, may have hurt the ambassadorship of Franklin in France. And, Franklin convinced the French to help the Americans overthrow monarchy. So you have one monarch paying the rabble and lower non-aristocratic classes of another monarch to overthrow the power of that monarch. And they either ignored or didn't see the danger of enabling a newly freed people to overthrow the monarchical rule that they live under. And the French government borrowed hundreds of millions of livres, their currency, to fund their own army and to loan to the Americans to fight the British because the French hate the British.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that bill came due around, say, 1789. And the French monarchy kept asking the various, what they call estates, but groups of people in France for more and more taxes. So the French monarchy taxes the second estate, the nobility, and they tried to tax the third estate, the clergy, and they just kept doing more and more taxes. And finally, the French people, nobility included, said, we're done with the taxes. We can't do it anymore. So it was debt that drove the taxes that caused the French Revolution. So it started with a Grand Assembly where they just told the king, we can't pay these taxes. And they actually went out to his tennis courts and they made a Declaration of the Rights of Man, much like the American Declaration of Independence, right? You know, where for us, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For them, it's égalité, liberté, fraternité, equality, liberty, and brotherhood, and the like. But it's part of that cauldron of the Age of Revolution where absolute monarchy is being crumbled by the rights of individuals to have a say in how they live their lives. But the French Revolution took a very different path than the American Revolution. The French Revolution was centered in Paris. Sort of, he who holds Paris holds France. Mm-hmm. And just after the French Revolution started, you had these waves of power-hungry people taking control of Paris. And you had something called the Committee of Safety, run by Robespierre, and they started killing everybody. And people who disagreed with them got killed. And there was essentially a civil war because the Parisians wanted to tax the other regions of France, and the other regions of France were like, oh, we're not down with that. So there was literally a civil war because in the mind of the French, Paris is the government and the regions are subsidiary to the Parisian government, to the French government. Mm-hmm. And out of this cauldron of all sorts of problems, finally emerged Napoleon, who basically took over and used the dual ideas of republic and monarchy and emperorship to push the revolution forward because, you know, once the Committee of Safety killed their king, all the other monarchies around the corner were like, well, we got a little problem with this. Maybe we don't want the French quite to be so powerful. And they invaded to reestablish monarchy. But the genie was out of the bottle, right? Between Cromwell killing his king, the Americans deposing British monarchical rule in America, and the French, killing their king and lots of their nobility, like the process was started and it just kept going in fits and starts from there forward. Mm-hmm. Right. But that's fundamentally different than the American Revolution, which was state-based, and the states fought and they came together to form a government, as opposed to the Parisian government enforcing its rule down on the regions. Right? It's a very different thing, much like the different form of government that it took. Whoa. Meaning, in Europe, they followed largely the parliamentary process. England had it, France had it, the Dutch Republic did not. The Dutch are much more like Americans in that way. They were city-states that formed a republic. The Swiss did not. But under a parliament, what you consider the three branches of government, the judicial, the executive, and the legislative, are not co-equal branches. Under a parliament, the executive branch is subsidiary to and bases its power from the legislative. What do I mean? So in England, for example, you have an election and you have however many people are in parliament, whatever, 300. I'm American, I don't know the exact number. Oh. And those 300 are spread across, say, 8 to 10 different parties. You've got Labour and Conservative and the Greens and the Scottish Independents and. And in order to, quote unquote, form a government, meaning install an executive team to run the government as opposed to a legislative team to pass laws, you need to cobble together a majority of parliamentarians to vote for the governmental slate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they don't have a president. They have a first minister or a prime minister, right? A member of parliament is a minister, and the one that is elected to run the government is the prime minister. And therefore, elections for the prime minister can happen honestly at any time, right? If the prime minister does something, then the coalition that elected the ministers to power can just say, I'm holding a vote of no confidence. And boom, the government falls, and they have to have a new election to elect a new parliament, to elect a new government.
Mm-hmm.
And the Americans saw this. They're like, right? That means that the administration of the government is just, at the whim of the parliament. And there's a lot of problems with that. Also, that doesn't really assert the rights of the states to do things. If the administration of the government can be changed all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Americans set out a very, very, very different structure, right? They set out and said the executive and the judicial and the legislative are all co-equal branches of government. They have specific roles and responsibilities, but they are separate and equal, and they balance each other out, right? In a parliamentary system, there's no balance, right? If Boris Johnson pisses off too many of his own party, he's just removed and he has no power.
Mm-hmm.
Where if Joe Biden pisses off too many of his party, it takes a lot to remove a president. A lot.
We've seen that.
We've seen that, right? It's only, we've only had, 3 presidents impeached, and then none of them convicted at trial, right? So it takes a lot. Besides the judicial being co-equal to everybody else, the judicial is nominated by the president and approved by the Senate, right? So the judicial is not dependent on, but balanced by the 2 other branches.
Mm-hmm.
The president is elected by the people of the states through an electoral college so that the states have some basis of participating in the election of the executive, but not a total basis, right? They didn't have the Senate elect the president, because there you'd have to get a majority of the states, but they didn't have the House of Representatives or the population elect the president, because then it was just be purely population based. So there is an imbalance because you have to balance out the wants and needs of the people and the wants and needs of the states, because the states are sovereign. The states are the contracting party to the Constitution, not the people. The states are, right? And that's why in the legislative branch, you have this hybrid compromise system. You have a lower house, which is population-based and is elected every 2 years. And you have this upper house, the Senate, which is turned over every 6 years, 1/3 every 2 years, and is represented equally among the states. It is meant to be a slow-moving and deliberative body. It is meant to be a check upon the unfettered urges of both the executive branch to appoint whoever they want to run government, because they have to advise and consent.
Mm-hmm.
And they're a check upon what the founders would call the passions of the populace, to willy-nilly declare war and do things, right? They're a check. They're not meant to be democratic. They're meant to be deliberative and slow-moving and Republican. Not in the political sense, but in the republic sense, where they think about the rights of people, right? Our founders disliked democracy intensely. They saw it as no different than being ruled by a monarch. right? If the passions of one, a monarch can be inflamed and dictate what you do with your life. That's very different than the passions of 50% plus one vote dictating what you can do with your life. They wanted participation in the government, but they also wanted the rights of minority groups to be protected by law and not to be overrun, right? Rights do not get voted on. Your right to free speech is not something that's granted and voted on. You have the right to express yourself, period.
Right. So when the Supreme Court does get involved in something, does it always rise up from the state to a circuit court, which I guess is a group of states, to the Supreme Court to decide simply if it's constitutional or not constitutional?
So,
is that correct?
In general, yes, but there are exceptions. So, in general, if the dispute is between two non-state parties, so say, someone who lives in Nevada sues somebody who lives in California, right? So it becomes a federal court issue, and it goes to the Ninth Circuit Federal Court, and then it goes to the Ninth Circuit Federal Appeals, and then it would go to the Supreme Court because it's a dispute among parties between states. Alternatively, if let's say there's make an easy one, right? There's a questionable search and seizure in the state of California by the police, and the defendant is asserting that his constitutional right to be under the Fourth Amendment to be protected, even though it was a state crime, it became a federal issue because of his assertion of the violation of the Fourth Amendment. Then it would go from a state court to a federal appeals court to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court really tries to take cases that have disputes among the circuits, right? If the Ninth Circuit Appellate Court ruled in a way that was in line with every other circuit court and or in line with how the Supreme Court had previously ruled on the issue, the Supreme Court might say, this has already been ruled on, we don't need to look at it. There are a couple of cases where pardon the pun, would go directly to the Supreme Court. And the most sort of important of them are disputes between the states themselves, right? So recently there was a case about water rights where I think it was like Tennessee and Mississippi or Tennessee and Alabama are fighting over who has rights to underground water that comes from a river and flows underground, et cetera, right? So this is this isn't private property. These aren't private citizens. These are issues between the states themselves, and the federal government and the Supreme Court is the court of first jurisdiction in disputes between the states themselves.
Okay,
but they're much rarer.
You want to come by me? I'll drive you home, or did you walk to me, or did you drive to me? Okay,
because I'm at work.
Gotcha.
Right, but the going back the Founding Fathers hated democracy.
Was there anything in existence at that time that was a democracy?
No, but
but yet they knew they couldn't go.
They knew it
fully in that direction.
So they had seen it in limited forms, and during the Reformation, and when cities would sort of break away and they become democracies. But they looked at Greece, and they looked at Rome, and they looked at history.
And there was no socialism or communism at that time.
They hated socialism. They hated.
Was there socialism at that time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Where?
So Thomas Jefferson is famous for saying something along the lines of, it is the grossest of violations to take the product and monies from one person because their father was too productive and give it to another because their father was not productive enough. I can dig out the exact quote. They believed in private property. They believed in keeping what you earn. They believed that we were citizens that should work and achieve and be moral, and we should have the rights to the fruits to our labor. Right? They did not believe in the redistribution of wealth via government. They were all for charity, but they weren't for forced government charity, right? Somehow, I think it's Thomas Sowell that says, it's hard to say, why is it greed to keep what you want, but not greed to take what somebody else has and give it to a third person, right? It's all greed, right? I think it was Franklin who said, democracy is 2 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, right? It was Adams who said that democracies never fail to burn themselves out and destroy themselves in a fit of violence and rage, right? Because if you have pure democracy, there's no reason to compromise at all. My job, if I'm in a democratic institution, a purely democratic institution, is to get 1 vote more than 50% and do whatever I want. And that's why the Senate said, okay, hold on. We want to be deliberative. We want to be slow. We want to put a brake on the passions of the populace and the passions of the lower house. We're going to say that big issues have to be decided by a filibuster-proof, almost supermajority of 60 votes. If you can't get 60% of the population to agree to something, then it probably is too conflicting to do it, is their view. And now you have the liberals and the Democrats and the progressives saying, that's anti-democratic. Well, yes, it's anti-democratic. They didn't want to be democratic. They hated democracy, right? We are a democratic republic, right? America is the AP class on civics, right? We expect ourselves to be citizens. We expect us to work hard. We expect us to participate. We expect us to be informed. It's expected for us to be moral, right? Franklin said, you now have a republic if you can keep it, right? Adams said that our Constitution is good only for moral and religious people and not good for any other, right? Because we have to be self-limiting and live as individuals and live within these limitations. Otherwise, if the view of our lives is you can do whatever you want until you're caught, then you're going to tax the resources of society to keep society going. Here's a great example. Do we not steal because we're going to get caught? Or do we not steal because it's immoral and wrong to steal, right? If you have a society where it's like, steal whatever you can until you get caught, well, then everybody has to spend money on security and everybody has to spend money on, right? Then you have to expend your societal and personal efforts on things that you don't have to expend if you have the morality of stealing being bad. When you have the expectation, right? Which is why you see these incredible increases in theft when you go and say, hey, if you steal less than $950 worth of stuff, it's just a misdemeanor. Okay, great.
Yes, this happened in California.
That has happened in California and San Francisco and other places, right? So, but going back to what we're trying to talk about, which is America is different. We are imperfect. We are not we are not perfect and we should be, what's the word? We should be subject to examination and change. But it should be done within the confines of the Constitution, where we have free speech, where if you don't like what I say, don't listen. Don't complain that you're offended and I shouldn't be able to say it. Right? Voltaire, a French revolutionary, said, I may not like what you say, but I will defend to the death your ability to say it. Right? Oh, I'm sorry you're offended that, I say something. Don't listen to it. Go away. Don't banish me. Don't say I can't say it. Don't say that, a person of one color saying a word is different than a person of another color. We should all be treated the same. We should be subject to the same laws, but we should all have the same freedoms, right? And those freedoms should extend to the freedom to succeed and the pain of failure. Failure is the best feedback mechanism to not do the same thing over and over. And that's why America is different, right? When you talk about the Second Amendment, for example, and you talk to Europeans, and they go, well, why do you Americans, you're crazy to have guns? It's like, we're citizens. The government works for us. The government was instituted to be limited in power to do specific things and no more. And if it gets out of line, we're here to stop it. I think it was Marcus Garvey, Black independence leader, I believe, said there are 4 boxes that American society depends on: the soapbox to speak, the ballot box to vote, the jury box to defend themselves in courts of law, and the cartridge box when all else fails.
Wow.
Right?
Wow. Never heard that before.
Yeah. And if you take away the soapbox, and in today's society, you cancel people and you don't let them speak on in what is now public forums like Facebook or Twitter, right? Which on the one hand, you say are private companies, right? But the other hand, do the bidding of governments, operate on government internet lines, and, could be considered the same as hotels, right? Why?
I'm surprised you said hotels. I thought you were going to say newspapers because they editorialize and censor as well.
No. So hotels were desegregated by force because they were public accommodation, because they were seen as essential to the functioning of public operation.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, how is Facebook and Twitter and YouTube not essential to the function of public discourse? Right? Yes, they're private companies, right? But they're part of interstate commerce, and they work on monopolistic internet lines that are sanctioned by local and federal governments, right? Which are the same thinking why private clubs were desegregated. Why? Because they use public roads to get there. They use public utilities to get there.
That's interesting. I would have thought in the case of hotels, since they're situated in a specific state, it would be against the interests of that state, not on a federal level, but on a local level, be biased against people and
Well, but it was the federal government that came in and said you cannot discriminate on the basis of race in an Atlanta hotel case. The logic was it affects interstate commerce, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, fine. Like, I'm not against that. I'm just saying use the same logic.
Yeah.
Right. And yes, I agree that YouTube and Facebook and the like have become essential to public discourse. And in fact, there are court cases that rule that they are essential to public discourse. And there are court cases that rule that information on them have value. Right. But to say that one group of people do not deserve to be heard because I don't like their message, okay, that's censorship. Now, is it okay for a private institution to censor? Yes, it is. But at what point does a large enough group become not private, right? Like, why are newspapers regulated? Why are mergers by newspapers regulated by the Federal Communication Commission, the FCC, right? Well, because we realize that information is critical to the discourse in America. And it goes back to the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we have to rethink these things all the time. Yes, we have to understand them. I mean, before you start thinking about them, you need to think about what is your a priori assumption, right? Is your a priori assumption that the federal government rules over everybody and that the states are subsidiary and that, the Constitution can mean whatever I want it to mean if I can find the word? Or is it that the states are primary and that the federal government is limited and that we should look back on the intent of the founders at the time of passing the laws? These affect how you interpret things, right? On the Second Amendment, when you look at a well-regulated militia being necessary to the exercise of a free state, why is that included? Why is it important? Does it affect things? Is that the reason for it? Or is that an explanation?
Mm-hmm.
These are all important things that affect how you think about it. And yelling and screaming at each other on YouTube and Facebook and saying you're a fascist and you're a Nazi and you should be killed, right? All of these exact same things happened in the Revolutionary War, they happened in the pubs. And the British lost the fight in the pubs. That's where the American ethos was born, when people sat around with a pipe in hand, drinking beer, complaining about today. That's where it was won and lost. And then today's pub is Facebook and YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And we've always said until modern times that you are free to say whatever you want. Offense is not a reason to not be able to say something. Words are not violence, right? Words are only violence when you're to the people in power. And that's why the left in the late 50s and early 60s was born out of the free speech movement in Berkeley. You should not be able to limit what I say. I should be able to protest the war. I should be able to do whatever I want. And now Berkeley is the number one persecutor of conservative voices because now the left is in power there, and they're not true free speechers. They're true free power for themselves.
Wow. So our next podcast, I have to digest this one like a thick steak.
Pick an amendment and let's go into it.
I think we should start with Second Amendment. Okay. I think there's a lot to be unpacked there.
Or we started the first, right? And just go first, second, third.
We could, although
Second Amendment is a hot dog.
It's a hot topic. I think there's a lot of stuff going on right now.
Yeah.
That we can talk about current events. And I also think that the what was that line? I'm going to screw it up.
Which one? The Second Amendment exists to protect the First Amendment.
Right. So.
Right. I mean, just to understand how wildly different the United States is. We have between 14 and 16 million licensed hunters in this country. The largest military standing army is about 3.5 to 4 million people in China. We have 14 million licensed snipers that hunt things. Yes, we're different, and proudly so. I don't want to be Europe. I don't want to be another country. Italy, with its parliamentary system, had over 50 governments in 55 years because one vote changes the government.
Mm-hmm.
That's not stable.
Very inefficient.
We have a stable government. As much as people complain about it, what they're complaining about is it's not getting me what I want. Government's not built to get you what you want. It's built to get what the vast majority of people want. The founders did not want an activist government. They wanted one contained and limited and controlled by the people and by the instruments of government. The other arms of government should control each other. It's a very different view. And with that, we should talk next week.
All right. Thanks for joining us.